Part 1. The Relic Among Giants. The space station was bigger than any city on Earth. It floated in the darkness between three stars, and its metal halls stretched for hundreds of kilometers in every direction. This was the Galactic Academy, the most famous military school in the known universe. Every year, thousands of young soldiers came here from hundreds of different planets. They came to learn. They came to prove themselves. They came to become heroes. Vance stood on the orientation platform with 500 other new cadets. She was 22 years old, with brown hair tied back in a simple knot and brown eyes that watched everything carefully. She was not tall. She was not beautiful in the way that caught attention. She was simply there, quiet and still, like a stone in a river while water rushed around it. Around her stood aliens of every kind. They were made of living crystal and light bent through their bodies like sunlight through glass. There were giants with stone-like skin and 4 powerful arms. Each one stood over 3 meters tall. There were graceful creatures with long limbs and clicking mandibles, and they moved like dancers even when standing still. There were dozens of other species too. Some had scales. Some had feathers. Some had no solid form at all. And then there was the only human in this group. Humanity had joined the Galactic Coalition only 80 years ago. In the eyes of species that had been traveling between stars for 10,000 years, humans were bobbies. They were newcomers. They were primitive. Knew what the others saw when they looked at her. They saw a small creature from a small planet that had spent most of its history fighting itself. They saw a species that had only recently stopped using nuclear weapons on each other. They saw someone who did not belong. But it was not herself that drew the most attention. It was her backpack. The pack was old, very old. The fabric had once been green, but years had turned it the color of dried mud. There were patches sewn over holes and patches sewn over those patches. One of the straps had been repaired with rough stitching that looked like it had been done by hand. The whole thing looked like it belonged in a museum, or perhaps in a garbage bin. A cadet named stood nearby with 2 of his companions. He was tall even for his species, and his mandibles clicked in a pattern that meant amusement. "Look at that," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. "Is that actual fabric? I thought humans had moved past such primitive materials." "Perhaps she could not afford proper equipment," one of his companions replied. "You know how humans are. They only stopped their unification wars 80 years ago. Some of their colonies still use chemical rockets." They laughed. It was not a kind sound. Other cadets nearby heard and turned to look. Some smiled. Some shook their heads. Made a sound like breaking glass, which was how his people expressed pity. Heard all of it. She saw all of it. Her face showed nothing. Her hand moved slowly to touch one of the backpack straps, and she held it gently, the way someone might hold the hand of an old friend. She said nothing at all. The platform's main doors opened with a heavy sound, and the cadets fell silent. Walked through, and the air itself seemed to grow heavier. This was High Commander, the Academy's chief instructor. His stone skin was marked with scars from 100 battles. His forearms were clasped behind his back in formal military position. His eyes were dark and deep, like caves that had seen things no one should see. Commander had served in the Galactic Defense Coalition for 40 years. He had fought in wars that had no names because no one wanted to remember them. He had seen the void breach of 442, where an entire star system had been swallowed by darkness. He had commanded ships during the siege of the cluster, when 1,000,000 soldiers had died defending a single planet. He had survived the Silent War, which was called silent because no one who truly understood it was willing to speak of what happened. Nothing surprised him anymore. Everyone said this. Commander had seen everything. "Cadets," his voice rolled across the platform like thunder from a distant storm. "You have been chosen because you are the best your species have offered. Over the next 4 cycles, you will be tested. You will be pushed beyond your limits. Many of you will fail and return home. Those who remain will earn the right to serve in the Coalition's combined fleet. This is not a promise. This is not a hope. This is simply the truth. He began to walk along the front row of cadets, his dark eyes examining each one. Some cadets stood when his gaze passed over them. Some looked away. One's crystal body flickered with nervous light. Then reached the section where stood. He stopped. His eyes moved to her backpack. At first, it seemed like he would say something about proper equipment, about standards, about the embarrassment of showing up to the galaxy's finest academy with something that looked like it had been pulled from ancient ruins. But then something changed. His upper right hand, which had been clasped behind his back, slowly moved forward. His eyes narrowed, not with anger but with something else, something that looked almost like recognition. "You," he said, his voice was different now, quieter, human, "come forward." Smiled at his companions. "Here it comes," he whispered. "She will be sent home before training even begins." Stepped out of the line and walked toward the commander. She moved smoothly with no wasted motion. Her steps were even and calm. If she was afraid, nothing showed on her face. She stopped before Commander and stood straight. The commander was not looking at her face. His full attention was on the backpack. As she came closer, he seemed to forget that anyone else existed. His breathing had changed. His hands, all four of them, had grown still in a way that did not seem natural. "May I?" he asked. It was a question, not a command. The most powerful instructor in the Galactic Academy was asking permission. The platform had gone completely silent. Every cadet watched. Even those who had been whispering stopped. Something was happening that they did not understand. Hesitated for only a moment. Then she nodded, slipped the pack from her shoulders and held it out. Commander took it with two hands, gently, as if it were made of something precious and fragile. He turned it slowly in his grip. His stone fingers traced the patches, the repairs, the places where the fabric had worn thin and been stitched back together. Then his fingers found something on the inside of the left strap, something that could not be seen unless someone knew exactly where to look. His hands began to shake. Part 2: Recognition. No one on the platform moved. No one spoke. The silence was so complete that could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Commander was shaking. This was not possible. Everyone knew this was not possible. They were stone-born, raised in the crushing gravity of mountain worlds, bred across 10,000 generations for war and discipline. Their bodies were harder than metal. Their minds were harder than their bodies. They did not show fear. They did not show sadness. They did not tremble. But's hands were trembling now, holding that worn and dirty backpack as if it were the most valuable thing in the universe. His fingers had found something on the inside of the left strap, a small circle of leather, dark with age, almost invisible against the faded fabric. Within that circle was a pattern that seemed to move in the light, lines that formed no symbol anyone could name, yet somehow felt full of meaning. The leather was stained a deep rust-brown color, the color of old blood. "Commander," one of his aides stepped forward, a young officer with concern on his face. "Is everything all right?" Did not answer him. Instead, he raised his head and looked at the assembled cadets. His eyes were different now. They were wet, though no tears fell. They could not cry, but something inside him was trying. "Do you know what this is?" His voice was rough, like stone grinding against stone. He held the backpack up for everyone to see. "Do any of you know what you are looking at?" Silence. The cadets looked at each other. They saw only a beaten old pack that should have been thrown away years ago. "This," said slowly, "is a blood seal of the campaign." Somewhere in the crowd, someone made a small sound, a sharp intake of breath, but most of the cadets showed no recognition. They were young. The campaign was history to them if they knew about it at all, a story from their grandparents' time. "Only 23 blood seals were ever given," continued. 23, in all the history of the Galactic Coalition. They were given to beings who entered the breach when our fleets refused to follow. when the Galactic Council declared the cluster a lost cause and ordered all military ships to retreat. He paused, his jaw tightened. 14 species, he said. 14 spacefaring civilizations with fleets that could darken the stars. And when billions of innocent people cried out for help, all 14 turned their backs and ran. Stood perfectly still. Her eyes had not left the commander's face. The Hollowed were coming through the breach, said. The name sent a visible shudder through many of the older officers present. You young ones have heard the name, you have heard the stories, but you do not understand. The Hollowed are not simply enemies. They are not soldiers or monsters in the way you think of such things. They come from the spaces between dimensions. They do not want our worlds or our resources. They want our minds. They feed on consciousness itself. They eat thoughts. They drink souls. And once they consume a mind, they wear it like clothing, using the memories and feelings of the dead to hunt the living. The platform had gone very cold. Who had been laughing its backpack only minutes ago had gone pale. His mandibles hung loose and still. The Coalition's greatest fleets refused to engage them directly, said. Our admirals calculated the odds and decided that fighting was impossible. So they called retreat. They left 3 billion people to be consumed, and they ordered observation ships to stay behind and record the extinction, so future generations would remember. His voice cracked on the last word. I was there, he said quietly. I was a young officer on an observation vessel. My orders were to watch, to document, to do nothing while billions screamed and died. Those were my orders. He looked down at the backpack in his hands. And then the humans came. A strange energy passed through the crowd. Many of the cadets turned to look at, seeing her differently now. She stood alone, small and quiet, her face still showing nothing. Humanity was new to the galaxy, continued. They had only made first contact with the Coalition a few decades before. They were not members. They had no treaty obligations. They had no reason to care what happened in the cluster. It was not their war. It was not their problem. The rational thing, the logical thing, would have been to stay home and let it happen. He almost smiled. It was not a happy expression. Humans are not rational. He turned to face directly. Your species sent 47 ships. Volunteers, every one of them. Crews who knew they would not return. They called themselves the Last Light Flotilla because they intended to be the last light those dying people saw before the darkness took them. His hand twitched at her side, just once, just for a moment. Their ships were old, said. Their technology was primitive compared to ours. Some of those vessels should not have survived the journey to the cluster, let alone the breach itself. Coalition engineers said they were held together with what humans call duct tape and prayer. Many of our admirals laughed when they saw the human flotilla approaching. They thought it was suicide. They thought it was foolishness. He raised the backpack higher. They were wrong. The commander looked out at the sea of young faces before him. Dozens of species, all of them silent, all of them listening. The Last Light Flotilla did not just fly to the cluster to die bravely, said. They flew directly into the breach, into the Hollowed spawning ground. They engaged the enemy that our greatest warships refused to face. A murmur passed through the crowd. This was not in the history books. This was not in the official records. Most of what the Coalition said about the campaign was about the tragic loss and the necessary sacrifice. It did not talk about humans flying where no one else would go. I watched from my observation post, said. I saw those 47 tiny ships fly into hell, and for 19 hours everything changed. He set the backpack down gently on a nearby platform, treating it with more care than he would give to sacred religious artifacts. For 19 hours the Hollowed stopped advancing. They recoiled. They pulled back from the civilian populations they had been consuming, and in those 19 hours, Coalition transport ships finally, shamefully, arrived to evacuate survivors. He looked at 2 billion people survived because of what your species did. 2 billion souls that my people, my government, had already written off as acceptable losses. His legs seemed to be having trouble supporting his weight. He leaned against a wall, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Of the 47 ships that entered the breach, said quietly, 3 came back out. Of the 3,000 humans who flew that mission, 91 returned alive. He picked up the backpack again. The blood seal was created to honor them. It is signed in the blood of every species they saved. 31 species contributed to each seal. 31 species whose children and exist today because humans refused to do the rational thing. He held the pack out too. This seal belongs to your family, which means someone in your blood was there. Someone you come from flew into the breach. Reached out and took the pack. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was calm. My grandmother, she said, Vance, she was first officer on the Defiant Promise, one of the 3 ships that made it back. Commander bowed his head. A commander, veteran of 100 battles, bowing to a young human cadet. Then you carry a legacy, he said, that most beings in this galaxy cannot imagine. Part 3, The Last Light. Commander stood silent for a long moment after took back the pack. The weight of memory seemed to press down on his shoulders. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with things he had kept inside for many years. You deserve to know the full truth, he said to the assembled cadets. Not the version in your history books, not the clean, polite version that makes everyone feel comfortable. You deserve to know what really happened in the breach and why the blood seal means what it means. He began to pace slowly, his 4 arms folded behind his back. The hollowed feed on consciousness, on thoughts, on the patterns that make a mind a mind. They reach into your head and they pull out everything that makes you who you are. Your memories, your hopes, your fears, your love for your family. They eat it all, and when they are done, there is nothing left. Not even a body, just empty space where a person used to be. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably. A young's crystal body flickered with distress. Our scientists studied them for centuries, continued. They learned that the hollowed require patterns to feed. They are like predators that hunt by sensing vibrations. A calm mind, an ordered mind, a disciplined mind. These are easy prey. The hollowed can read the patterns and consume them efficiently. He stopped packing and turned to face the crowd. This is why our fleets could not fight them. Warriors are trained from birth to maintain perfect mental discipline. Thought patterns are crystalline and ordered. Minds are structured like mathematical equations. Every species with advanced technology has learned to organize their thinking. It is what allows us to build starships and communicate across species. It is also what makes us perfect prey. He looked at, but humans are different. Met his gaze steadily. She knew where this was going. Her grandmother had told her stories late at night in the years before she died, stories that never made it into any official record. Human minds are chaos, said. There was no insult in his voice, only wonder. Your species evolved on a death world where everything wanted to kill you. Predators, weather, disease, each other. You survived not by being stronger or faster, but by being unpredictable. Your brains learned to think in multiple directions at once, to jump from idea to idea without logic, to feel emotions so powerful that they override all rational thought. He almost laughed. Your scientists call it pattern recognition under extreme stress. Your soldiers have another name for it. They call it spite. A few humans in other sections of the academy had gathered at the edges of the platform, drawn by the commotion. They stood taller at the word. The captains of the Last Light Flotilla understood something that our greatest admirals missed, said. They realized that they could not destroy the hollowed. No weapon could hurt them. No shield could block them, but they could be confused. They could be disrupted. If the hollowed needed patterns to feed, then the answer was to give them noise instead. He turned to face the observation windows, looking out at the stars. 47 ships flew into the breach. 3,000 humans who knew they would probably die. They did not go quietly. They did not go with calm acceptance. They went screaming. The platform was utterly silent. They broadcast on every frequency. Music, shouting, random noise. They thought of their families and their homes and every person they had ever loved. They let their fear and their anger and their hope crash through their minds like storms. They did not try to be brave in the way that meant being calm. They were brave in the way that meant feeling everything at once and refusing to stop. His voice dropped lower. The Hollowed tried to feed on them, and they could not. He turned back to face the cadets. Imagine a predator that hunts by listening for footsteps. Now imagine prey that does not walk but explodes. That is what human minds looked like to the Hollowed. Not a meal but a bomb, not a pattern but static. The creatures recoiled. They pulled back. They tried to consume and found only chaos that burned them from the inside. Made a small sound. His mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of deep distress among his people. For 19 hours the last light flotilla held the breach, not with weapons, not with shields, with the sheer force of human emotional chaos. They screamed and they cried and they laughed and they raged, and the Hollowed could not touch them. He paused. But 19 hours is a long time. The human mind can only maintain that level of intensity for so long. One by one, the crews began to tire. The chaos faded into patterns as exhaustion took hold, and when the patterns returned, the Hollowed fed. His voice became very quiet. I watched from my observation post. I saw the ships go dark, one by one. 44 ships fell in the breach. 44 crews were consumed. And still the last 3 held on, buying minutes, then seconds, for the evacuation transports to escape with their cargo of survivors. His grip tightened on the pack strap. She knew the names of those ships. Her grandmother had made her memorize them when she was a little girl. 44 ships, 44 crews, almost 3,000 names that should never be forgotten. Your grandmother's ship, the Defiant Promise, was one of the last 3, said Tu. Her captain was a man named James. When the other ships began to fall, he ordered his crew to do something that should have been impossible. He told them to get angry. Stone face shifted into something that might have been admiration. Not afraid, not sad, angry. He told them to think about the coalition fleets that had abandoned those civilians. He told them to think about the admirals who had decided that 3 billion lives were not worth fighting for. He told them to take all their fear and all their grief and turn it into rage. He shook his head slowly. Human spite, it is a force of nature. It is the ability to look at impossible odds and say no. Not I cannot or I should not, but simply no, I refuse. The Defiant Promise held the breach for 6 more hours on nothing but anger. 6 hours of the crew refusing to die because they were too furious to let the universe win. The gathered humans stood. Some had tears in their eyes, but they were not sad tears. When the evacuation was complete, the last 3 ships fought their way out of the breach. They had no weapons left. Their engines were failing. Half their crews were dead or dying. But they flew out because humans do not know how to give up, even when giving up makes sense. Picked up a data tablet from a nearby console. He tapped it several times, and a holographic display appeared above the platform. It showed a list of names. Thousands of names scrolling slowly upward. These are the volunteers of the last light flotilla. Every name, every ship, every human who flew into the dark so that strangers could live. The names kept scrolling, and scrolling, and scrolling. The Galactic Council wanted to bury this story, said. They were ashamed. 14 ancient species with all their technology and all their power, saved by newcomers in ships held together with tape. So they classified the details. They talked about the tragedy of the cluster without mentioning who had actually done something about it. His voice hardened. But some of us remember. Some of us were there. and we made sure that the blood seals would survive even if the official story did not. The list of names finally stopped scrolling. At the bottom, highlighted in gold, were 91 names, the survivors. Third from the top, Vance First Officer, Defiant Promise, stared at her grandmother's name floating in light above the platform. She had known the story. She had grown up with it, but seeing it here, acknowledged, honored, remembered, something broke loose in her chest. The blood seal is signed in the blood of every species that was saved that day, said. 31 species contributed. 31 species whose children exist because humans refuse to be sensible. He looked at, and there was something almost gentle in his ancient war face. Your grandmother gave you that pack for a reason. She wanted you to remember what humanity is capable of. Not our technology, not our weapons, but our stubborn, irrational, beautiful refusal to let the darkness win. Part 4, Inheritance. The holographic display faded. The names of the fallen and the survivors dissolved into the air like morning mist, but their weight remained, pressing down on every cadet present. Commander turned to address the full assembly once more. His voice had regained some of its commanding strength, but underneath it was something raw that had not been there before. I have told you this story for a reason, he said, and it is not simply to honor Cadet Vance or her grandmother. It is to correct a mistake that too many of you have made. A mistake I have seen repeated across decades, across species, across countless interactions between the Coalition and humanity. He swept his gaze across the crowd. Many cadets looked away, seemed to be trying to disappear into the floor. You looked at this cadet and saw her size. You looked at her equipment and saw its age. You looked at her species and saw its youth. And from these observations, you drew conclusions about her worth. He let the words hang in the air. You were wrong. Walked toward, his heavy footsteps echoing in the silence. He stopped beside her and turned to face the crowd, standing shoulder to shoulder with the small human in her worn uniform. Humanity is not a powerful species by the standards you understand. They are not strong like the. They are not brilliant like the. They are not ancient like the. By every measure that we use to judge worth, they should be nothing. They should be forgotten. He placed one massive stone hand on shoulder. The gesture was gentle, almost fatherly. But they are here. They survived a planet that should have killed them 1,000 times over. They survived each other, which was perhaps the greater challenge. They clawed their way to the stars with technology so primitive that it makes our engineers weep. And when the galaxy's oldest civilizations abandoned innocent people to die, they flew into hell anyway. His grip tightened slightly. This is what humanity brings to the Coalition. Not advanced weapons, not superior technology, something far more valuable, something that cannot be manufactured or programmed or taught. He looked down at. They bring the refusal to accept impossible odds. They bring the insane, irrational, glorious stubbornness of a species that evolved by being too angry to die. Looked up at him. Her face was still calm, but something burned behind her eyes. A quiet fire that had been there all along, waiting. This cadet, continued, carries the blood debt of 31 species in a backpack that you mocked as primitive. That primitive pack has seen the inside of the breach. It has been where your shining equipment would have melted. It has survived what killed 2,909 of the bravest soldiers in galactic history. He removed his hand from her shoulder and stepped back. From this day forward, you will show Cadet Vance the respect she is owed, not because I order it, not because I outrank you, but because when your grandparents were screaming for help, hers answered. When your species decided that some people were not worth saving, hers decided otherwise. The silence stretched on. Then slowly, movement began to ripple through the crowd. The first to step forward was a cadet, a young female with smoother skin than the commander but the same deep, serious eyes. She crossed the platform until she stood before, then placed her right fist over her heart, the traditional gesture of profound respect. My great-grandmother was on Prime when the Hollowed came, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. She was pregnant with my grandmother at the time. If the evacuation had come 6 hours later, neither of them would have survived. She bowed her head. I am alive because of what your people did. My entire family line exists because humans refused to listen when they were told that fighting was impossible. She stepped back. Another cadet took her place, his crystal body pulsing with soft blue light. My species lost a colony world in the cluster, he said. 400 million lived there. 380 million were evacuated. The rest, he paused, gathering himself. The rest were already being consumed when the last light flotilla arrived. But the flotilla bought enough time for my mother's family to reach the transport ships. She was 3 years old. He touched his chest, and his crystal form chimed softly, the gesture of gratitude. Thank you, he said simply and stepped aside. One by one, cadets came forward, species after species, stories after stories. Whose grandmother had been a nurse on an evacuation ship, treating human survivors whose minds had been damaged by proximity to the Hollowed. A creature made of living gas whose entire species had been refugees on when the attack came. A small, furry being from a species so rare that only a few thousand remained, all of them descended from survivors of the breach. Was one of the last to approach. He walked slowly, his earlier arrogance completely stripped away. When he reached, he did not meet her eyes. I spoke poorly, he said, his mandibles clicked with shame. I judged without knowledge, I mocked without understanding. He forced himself to look up. Among my people, such behavior is considered the mark of a fool and a coward. I have shown myself to be both today. He performed a complex gesture with his limbs, a formal apology. I ask your forgiveness, he said. I do not deserve it, but I ask. Studied him for a long moment. The entire platform held its breath. Then she extended her hand. Not to shake, a human gesture that most aliens found confusing, but simply open, palm upward. My grandmother used to say that everyone makes mistakes, said. What matters is what you do afterward. Looked at her hand. Then slowly he reached out and touched his own limb to her palm. Among his people, this was the acceptance of apology, the restoration of honor. Thank you, he said quietly. When the procession of cadets finally ended, Commander stepped forward again. The hard lines of his face had softened, and he looked at with something that might have been warmth. You have questions, he said. It was not a guess. I can see them in your eyes. Ask. Hesitated. Then she asked the question that had been burning in her since she was a little girl listening to her grandmother's stories. Why, she said. The council buried the truth. They hid what humanity did. They made it seem like the evacuation just happened, like it was their decision all along. Why would they hide the sacrifice that saved so many lives? Sighed, it was a heavy sound, like rocks settling. Because the truth was too painful, he said. Not for you, for us, for the council, for every species that turned its back that day. He looked out at the stars, beyond the observation windows. If the official history acknowledged what humanity did, it would also have to acknowledge what we did not do. It would have to admit that the Galactic Coalition, with all its power and all its wisdom, chose to let billions die rather than take a risk. And it would have to admit that a species of newcomers, barely out of their own atmosphere, showed more courage in a single day than we had shown in 10,000 years. His voice grew bitter. Pride is a powerful thing. It makes species do terrible things to protect their image of themselves. The council chose to bury the truth rather than face it. Nodded slowly. She had suspected as much. Her grandmother had never been angry about it, just sad, in a quiet way that only understood now. But some of us remember, said. Some of us refuse to let the truth die. That is why the blood seals exist. That is why I tell this story to every new class of cadets. because the galaxy owes a debt that can never be repaid, and the least we can do is remember who we owe it to. He turned back to face the assembly. Let this be a lesson to all of you. Strength is not always visible. Courage does not always announce itself. And the species that saves you when darkness comes may not be the one you expect. He looked at one final time. Sometimes it is the small one with the worn backpack, the one you did not notice until it was too late. Part 5. What we carry. The orientation ceremony ended an hour later. Cadets were assigned to their quarters, given their training schedules, and dismissed to prepare for the challenges ahead. But no one talked about training. No one talked about schedules. Every conversation in every corridor was about the same thing. The human with the backpack, the blood seal, the last light flotilla, did not return to her quarters immediately. Instead, she made her way to the Academy's observation deck, a curved platform at the station's highest point, where vast windows looked out at the endless dark. The station orbited a pulsar, and its rhythmic light swept across the deck every few seconds, painting everything in alternating gold and shadow. She sat on a bench near the windows and pulled the backpack into her lap. For a long moment, she simply held it, feeling its familiar weight, tracing the patches and repairs with her fingers. "You never told me it would be like this, grandmother," she said quietly to the empty room. "You never told me what it would feel like to carry your story." There was no answer. There never was. Vance had died 7 years ago, peacefully in her bed, surrounded by family. She had lived to see her granddaughter accepted into the Galactic Academy. She had lived to know that the legacy would continue. But she had never explained what it meant to be the one carrying that legacy forward. Footsteps echoed behind. She did not turn around. She had heard multiple sets of feet, different weights and gaits, and she knew who was coming. Was the first to speak. "May we join you?" Finally looked over her shoulder. The stood at the entrance to the observation deck, and behind him were at least a dozen other cadets. The young female who had spoken first, the with the glowing crystal body. Others she recognized from the ceremony. Others she did not. "Of course," she said. They filed onto the deck and found places to sit or stand around her. For a while, no one spoke. They simply watched the pulsar's light sweep across the void, painting the darkness with momentary gold. Finally, the female, her name had learned, broke the silence. "May I ask you something?" Nodded. "Your grandmother, what was she like?" Considered the question. It was not an easy one to answer. Vance had been many things: a hero, a survivor, a woman who woke up screaming some nights from dreams she would never describe, a grandmother who made the best miso soup in the colony and sang old Earth songs when she thought no one was listening. "She was small," said finally, "even smaller than me. When I was a child, I thought she was the gentlest person in the world. She never raised her voice. She never seemed angry. She would sit in her garden for hours just watching flowers grow." She ran her fingers over the blood seal, hidden inside the strap. "But sometimes I would catch her looking at the sky, and in those moments I could see something else, something hard, something that had learned to survive things that should have killed her." Leaned forward. His earlier shame had faded into genuine curiosity. "Did she ever speak of what happened in the breach?" "Not often," admitted, "and never directly. She did not like to remember, but sometimes late at night she would tell me pieces, small things, the sound of the engines when they crossed into hollowed space, the way the lights flickered when the creatures tried to feed, the screaming not of pain but of rage as Captain ordered everyone to get angry and stay angry." She looked out at the stars. "She told me that the worst part was not the fear. The worst part was the silence afterward, when the fighting was over and they realized how few of them were left, when they looked around and saw empty stations where friends had been standing, when the anger faded and grief came rushing in to fill the space." His name made a soft chiming sound. How did she live with it? How did any of them live with what they had seen? Smiled, it was a small, sad expression. She said that you do not live with it. You live around it. You build a life and you fill it with good things and you learn to carry the weight without letting it crush you. She raised a family. She planted gardens. She taught her to cook and to sing and to look at the stars without fear. She held up the backpack. And she kept this, always. She said it reminded her of two things. First, what humans are capable of when everyone else gives up. And second, that carrying something heavy does not mean you have to carry it alone. Reached out and touched the pack gently, as if touching a religious artifact. I do not understand humans, she admitted. My people are warriors born. We train from childhood to face death without flinching. We believe that courage means accepting fate with dignity. She looked at, but your species does not accept fate at all. You fight it. You rage against it. You look at impossible situations and refuse to believe they are impossible. This is. She searched for the right word. This is terrifying, she concluded, and beautiful. I do not know how to hold both feelings at once. Laughed. It was a warm sound, unexpected and genuine. That, she said, is exactly what being human feels like. The pulsar's light swept across the deck again. In its glow, the assembled cadets looked less like strangers and more like something else, something that might, in time, become a family. Spoke again, his voice thoughtful now. The commander said that the galaxy owes humanity a debt. He said it can never be repaid, but surely there must be something we can do, some way to honor the sacrifice. Considered this. She thought about her grandmother, sitting in her garden, watching flowers grow. She thought about the 91 survivors and the thousands who did not return. She thought about the weight of the pack on her shoulders and the blood sealed inside its strap. My grandmother used to say that the best way to honor the dead is to make their sacrifice mean something, she said. The last light flotilla did not fly into the breach so that people could feel grateful. They flew so that people could live. So the best way to honor them is to live, to build, to protect the things that matter. She looked around at the gathered cadets. That is why we are here, is it not? To learn how to protect the galaxy, to become the people who answer when others cry for help. If you want to honor what humanity did 80 years ago, then become the kind of person who would do the same thing. Stone face shifted into something that might have been a smile. You ask us to become like humans, she said, stubborn and irrational and full of spite. Grinned. I am asking you to become the kind of person who looks at impossible odds and says, no. The species does not matter. The technology does not matter. What matters is the willingness to try when trying seems pointless. She stood up, slinging the pack over her shoulder. Its familiar weight settled against her spine like an old friend. Somewhere out there, she said, looking at the stars, the breach still exists. The hollowed are still waiting. And someday, maybe tomorrow, maybe in 100 years, they will come again. When that day arrives, the galaxy will need people who refuse to calculate the odds, who refuse to ask whether fighting is strategically viable, who look at the darkness and choose to be light anyway. She turned to face the cadets. That is what we carry, not just memory, not just gratitude, but responsibility. The last light flotilla showed the galaxy what is possible when people refuse to give up. Now it is our turn to show them again. The pulsar's light swept across the deck one more time. In its golden glow, Vance stood small but unbreakable, carrying the weight of 31 species' gratitude and 3,000 heroes' legacy. And around her, cadets from a dozen worlds rose to their feet, not because anyone ordered them to, but because they finally understood what humanity had always known. Someone has to, and it might as well be them.